thank you very much for inviting me to give a talk in your series. I've managed to look at the other talks in the last week because I was busy doing something else on Tuesday afternoons. Yeah, they've all been really great. So I hope I can be even partly up to that standard. So I'm going to talk to you today about birds and forestry. And can everybody hear me okay before we get started?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Okay. Interesting. Not sure how to advance slides now. Anybody know?
Try clicking on the arrows, seeing if that works.
I have no arrows.
Okay, maybe just clicking. Yeah, just click on the screen.
Oh, there we go. Okay, so I'm going to be, I have a lot of stuff in here, and it may be that I'm going to run out of time, but what I wanted to talk to you about is why we're concerned about birds, the biodiversity crisis, declines in bird populations, species at risk, and other species of conservation concern in this region. A little bit about what is a migratory bird, why is that important, and then I'll spend some time talking about how we know about the bird species in Nova Scotia, their population trends and their habitat needs, specifically in the Acadian forest of Nova Scotia. But then obviously some of the work may have been done in other areas of the Acadian forest. So hopefully by the end of the talk, you'll learn something about species associated with different stand types and ages, species that are more sensitive to harvesting within a stand and also harvesting at the landscape scale. And then strategies for incorporating birds into forest management in Nova Scotia. And then we'll have questions. So to start with, just a little background about why birds are useful as environmental indicators. In addition to being important in their own right, they're quite sensitive to anthropogenic change. They occupy a range of forest habitat types of different ages, different forest types, such as more hardwood or more softwood. And they are sensitive to different vegetation layers in the forest. And so different species require vegetation in particular layers for them to be able to nest in the habitat. They have strong links to specific habitat features. This has been shown in study after study with various species. They are near the top of the food chain, and of course, some of the raptors are at the top of the food chain. They are easy to study compared to other organisms, except maybe plants. At least they're easy to identify and count. There's lots of long-term data available, and birds, people like birds, they resonate with people. So in 2018, there were two news bulletins about biodiversity decline that I found particularly disturbing. The first was the Living Planet Index, produced by World Wildlife Fund, where they showed across the globe, vertebrate species have declined by 60% since 1970. So 1970 is sort of a benchmark year. That's when the breeding bird survey started, and basically people started paying attention to birds in terms of counting them. And then BirdLife International produced the State of the World Birds Report and showed that populations of at least 40% of the bird species across the world are declining. Then the next year, in Science, the Rosenberg et al. Article called Decline of the North American Avifauna was published, showing that nearly 3 billion birds have been lost since 1970. And these are some of the infographics from that were produced from Cornell. So forests alone have lost 1 billion birds since 1970. In eastern North America, 64% of the forest bird species are declining. Boreal forests have lost 500 million birds, eastern forests 170 million birds. Two groups that have lost the most, have shown the steepest declines, are the aerial insectivores. These are birds that catch flying insects for their food, either on the wing. The ones that are continuously flying to catch insects have shown the steepest declines, but other insectivores like the flycatchers are also showing sharp declines. And then migratory birds. So 2.5 billion migratory birds have been lost since 1970. So we're interested in migratory birds. Why are they declining so much? Well, hard to know for sure, but what can we do to support them? Also in the report, they noticed that there were certain groups of birds that have increased, actually, and these are conservation success stories. The waterfowl, the raptors, and the woodpeckers are all increasing, and these can be attributed to the management of wetland resources for waterfowl, the reduction of hunting, of killing raptors and using DDT and other pesticides, and for woodpeckers, I'm not sure when maybe some of the if there are any foresters on the line, maybe they would know when did keeping standing dead trees for woodpeckers start to be incorporated into forestry practices. At any rate, those are three groups of sort of success stories, and that's heartening, meaning that if we put the same interest and effort into conserving other groups, we may have a chance. Okay, so everyone is interested in species at risk. Which ones are breeding in our forested landscapes? Here's a list of some of the more common ones and roughly where they nest. The common nighthawk, it doesn't nest in trees, but it nests on the ground and uses clear cuts and barrens. The chimney swift will nest in tall trees with chimney-like cavities, although we have very little information of these natural cavities, where these natural cavities are in the wild. Bank swallows will nest in earthen banks and dirt piles, which may be in your woodlot or working forest. Eastern wood pewees need mature, multi-layered forests with small canopy gaps for foraging, and they nest in the mid-canopy. Olive-sided flycatchers nest in mature spruce, in swamps, and along the edges of bogs. And they also will use the edges of harvested stands if the edges are mainly spruce, and they particularly like black spruce. Canada warbler nests on the ground in mixed wood swamps that are very densely vegetated. Rusty blackbird nests in small conifers near water, feeding in shallow water and using the forest along many kilometers of streams and ponds. And the evening grosbeak is a bird of the mature mixedwood, and it's a specialist on mast, things like acorns. However, there are many other species of conservation concern that are not legally listed as at risk, that are still sensitive. These include the blackback woodpecker, yellow-belly flycatcher, great-crested flycatcher, Canada jay, boreal chickadee, ruby-crowned kinglet, golden-crowned kinglet, Tennessee warbler, rose-breasted grosbeak, bay-breasted warbler, Cape May warbler, pine grosbeak, and pine siskin. And what I have noticed in doing forest or wetland surveys is that 7 of these species, is that 7? The ones with asterisks are also commonly found in forested wetlands. So forested wetlands seem to be pretty important for a lot of species at risk and rare birds. But even some of our most common birds are declining. Recently, we went through the breeding bird survey trends for Nova Scotia. I'll explain in a bit what the breeding bird survey is. But I looked at the trends for Nova Scotia and PEI. Those are when they're presenting, analyzing the trends, they group those two provinces together. And on the right side is the olive-sided flycatcher, which I'm showing for comparison because it is a listed species at risk. But even the magnolia warbler, which is one of our most common forest birds, has declined by a third since 1970. Okay, so if you think about migratory birds, then you may think about Canada's Migratory Bird Convention Act. This act provides legal protection for birds, their nests, eggs, and nestlings from destruction. So you may think, well, only migratory birds are covered, but actually that's not true. All bird species, except some that were considered problematic years ago when the convention was being established, are included. So the ones that are excluded are the raptors, and these include both resident and migratory species, the kingfishers, well, we have one species, and it's migratory, the crows, the jays, the ravens, these are resident birds, and the blackbirds, and these are migratory. Even the rusty blackbird, ring-winged blackbird, and common grackle, these are all declining species, and they're migratory, but they're not covered by the Migratory Bird Convention Act. So all other native species in Nova Scotia, whether they migrate or not, are covered under the Act. Okay, so let's focus a little bit on migratory birds. So if a bird is not migratory, then it's a resident. So residents stay in Nova Scotia year-round. Temperate migrants are birds that migrate, they leave Nova Scotia, they migrate to other parts of North America for the winter, so basically they're going to the US. And then we have neotropical migrants. Neotropical refers to the New World tropics. And so they have wintering sites either in Mexico and Central America or in South America. And recent studies have shown that the birds that have to migrate the furthest into South America seem to be doing the poorest. They're showing the largest declines in general. There's a recent scientific paper published just in June showing that neotropical migrants may be more sensitive to the effects of climate change and more vulnerable to future climate change than birds that either are resident or that only migrate within the temperate zone. So they looked at a large number of eastern temperate birds. Actually, none of the species were the same species that we have here. So they are dealing with different species, but so it would be neat to do a similar study with the birds that we have here. So one thing they noticed is that they're basically what they're looking at is the range that the birds are using, sort of the geographic range the birds are using throughout the year. And they showed that range shifts started in the mid-1980s, which is when we started seeing larger signals of climate change. So they grouped birds into those three categories: residents, temperate migrants, and neotropical migrants. So they found that the temperate migrants, so for example, things like a yellow-rumped warbler that will perhaps only spend the winter, or palm warbler that will spend the winter in the southern US, or residents like our, for example, maybe our song sparrows, they're successfully adapting at their range's southern edges, and they are also extending their ranges northward. So they seem to be responding to climate change in a positive way. Whereas when they looked at the neotropical migrants, they found their ranges were getting smaller. The southern edges were moving northward, but their northern edges were not moving northward. So they seem not, it looks like they're not being able to adapt to changing climate. And so this is really exciting because it's it's a possible explanation for why neotropical migrants are showing larger declines than other species. Okay, so something else important about our birds refers to their natural history. So, but it's important to understand this to sort of understand how they fit into forests and how forestry affects them. They are highly territorial, most of the species. The only species that aren't very territorial are the finches. So these highly territorial species defend all-purpose territories. They use these for nesting and foraging, so they pretty much stay within that area. They defend the territory. Primarily the males do this by singing. If they're not songbirds, if they're woodpeckers, they may use calls or drums, and there may be other displays that are used. But they defend their territory from other individuals of the same species. The size of territory differs among species, and so this is important in terms of if you want to know how many individuals or breeding pairs might fit into a particular stand if it's the right habitat. The smallest territories are least flycatchers of about a third of a hectare. A lot of the smaller songbirds have territories that are about 1 hectare in size. This includes the warblers, the vireos, and juncos. Thrushes and peewees, these are larger birds and they have larger territories, 2 to 3 hectares approximately. Then larger territories are found for the woodpeckers and also the brown creeper. Even though it's a tiny bird, it needs a lot of tree trunks, so the territories are quite large. And the larger woodpeckers tend to have larger territories, and the pileated woodpecker having one of the largest, and also the raptors and 2 of the birds that I've been studying also have really large territories, olive-sided flycatchers and rusty blackbirds. One observation that most people studying birds have noticed in their populations is that if you have better quality habitat, the territories tend to be smaller because you have more competition to get a territory, and so the birds sort of crowd in together. Also, I think it's important to understanding how birds relate to a particular woodlot is the idea of site fidelity. So site fidelity means that the bird will come back to the same place the next year after it's gone away to either the US or the Central America or South America for the winter. Studies have shown that birds generally don't come back to the exact place where they hatched. It's a really hard thing to study, but people have banded a lot of birds in a population and very few birds. They rarely see birds that were banded as nestlings. So they disperse in the range of kilometers or perhaps tens or hundreds of kilometers in terms of where they're going to end up coming to breed. After their first breeding season, though, so a bird establishes a territory, spends the breeding season on that territory, and then they go away for the winter, they come back to the same site the next year if they're still alive. Studies after studies have shown that this is the usual case. And many times they're coming back to the same territory in the next year. A study by Bernard et al. In the Auk on ovenbirds showed that they followed ovenbirds for 12 years, and I think one of the birds lived for 11 years, and they found that the birds were coming back to not only the same plot, but the same territory, moving only on average about 66 meters from year to year. So I think this has importance in terms of when you modify a habitat. For example, if you clear cut a stand, the birds that were breeding in that stand, they're going to be coming back looking for their territory, and it's not going to be there. So I think that we already know enough to start incorporating more considerations about birds into our forage management planning than we currently are. There's been considerable research on the effects of forestry on birds in Canada and in the northeastern North America. And of most relevant are studies that were done either in Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, or Maine. I'll talk a little bit about some of the Nova Scotia research I've been involved in. But there's also in 1993, and this is pertinent to the Southwest Nova Scotia, there was a study commissioned by Bowater Mersey. I think they ran it in 1990 and 1991, surveyed birds in the Rossignol district of the Bowater Holdings. So that's a great baseline data set that could be used. Bill Freeman did a number of studies in 1985 to 1999. I've been involved in a number of bird habitat relationships, looking at populations in protected and working landscapes. Sorry. And also studies on using birds as ecological indicators, the width of riparian buffers, and forested wetlands. There are a lot of beneficial management practices that, for example, that are already in use in Maine that could be adapted for Nova Scotia. I'll be talking about those more at the end of the talk. And there are special management practices that I think are currently in development by the province of Nova Scotia. Okay, so how do we know about the distribution and population status of birds? The Breeding Bird Survey is the main source of trend data for land birds in North America. So that includes Nova Scotia. It informs conservation priorities at the regional scale and also at the provincial scale. It's done by volunteers. It's a roadside survey done in one morning, 50 stops. You stop for 3 minutes and drive to the next stop, and you just record all the birds you count. And this is the basis for most of the songbird trend data for North America. I would argue that it's not adequate for determining bird trends as they relate to forestry in Nova Scotia, because these routes, which are shown on the map here, are primarily not through areas, large logging areas. They're mostly along paved roads. So I think Nova Scotia needs some sort of a provincial forest bird monitoring program. We also know about birds through the breeding bird atlases. The second version of the Maritimes Breeding Bird Atlas was run in 2005 to 2010, or sorry, should say 2006 to 2010. So they're looking at what species were breeding in 10 by 10 kilometer squares. And also they did some point counts, which is basically a 5-minute point count instead of a 3-minute point count used by the Breeding Bird Survey. And so a little bit of habitat information has been extracted for the point-specific data that was collected. But in terms of declines, it's really easy to see how a species like the rusty blackbird has disappeared or couldn't be found from quite a few of the sites where it was found in the first atlas, which is shown on the left side. On the right side, the little dots with a black, little squares of the black dot were places where people couldn't find them in the second atlas. So these maps are very useful for informing conservation priorities. So I mentioned that Nova Scotia needs a FourSpirit Monitoring Program. So I helped set up the FourSpirit Monitoring Program in Ketchimakujik National Park. We looked, well, we selected hemlock stands and maple oak pine stands. So hemlock dominated and hardwood dominated stands, and surveyed 100 points in these stands. We used the point count method. So point counts are a standard method to determine forest bird abundances. In our case, we visited the site, which, as you can see in this picture, is marked with a stake. Twice between late May and early July, we recorded all the birds heard and seen in 10 minutes. And then we come up with an abundance based on those data, or an actual density per hectare per species. So my student, Stephen Gullidge, did that study in 2003, 2004, and what he found was, if you look at the little diagram in the upper right, those are all those are sites that are grouped. The closer the sites are, the more similar the bird communities. And the hemlock stands basically were completely separated from the hardwood stands in terms of when you look at the bird community. So it showed very strong species relationships for many of the species to forest composition. And the species are now being looked at in terms of being grouped into 3 groups: mature hemlock species, mature hardwood species, and mature mixedwood species. And their trends are being tracked over time now as an index of the ecological integrity of the forest. While doing our studies, we noticed an outbreak of a native moth, the pale-winged gray, which attacked eastern hemlocks. We measured the amount of foliage in the upper and lower canopy, which you can see on the left side. Upper canopy is the bright green, lower canopy the dark green. And between 2004 and 2012, there was a large change in terms of canopy. We lost a lot of the basically all of the lower canopy and much of the upper canopy in some of the plots. And along with that, the bay-breasted warbler, which is also a budworm specialist, disappeared from 2 of the plots. We have used bird and vegetation surveys to compare the habitat and birds in the park versus in the working landscape. And so this was a study done in the Medway region of Bowater. And this is just a graph showing, in terms of the vegetation structure, from the green being high trees to the yellow being ground vegetation, how the structure of the vegetation in stands as similar as we could find them in the working landscape still tended to differ a bit from what we found in the park. And in terms of the bird communities in the 2 areas, in the harvested landscape, we found fewer forest raptors, fewer hawks and owls, fewer woodpeckers, fewer nuthatches and creepers that also forage on bark. We found fewer species or fewer individuals of species that feed high and nest high, and species that need a complex layered forest. Fewer flycatchers and aerial insectivores, fewer species that have been shown to be sensitive to habitat fragmentation in other studies, and certain unique species like the northern parula that nests in hanging lichens. So we compared the vegetation in the park versus the working landscape and found that the parulas were more common, and their presence was associated with longer hanging lichens, more closed canopy forests, and taller trees. I guess just to emphasize a point, this is our only bird that actually weaves a nest in a hanging bunch of usnea, which you can see on the left side. We also did a study in the Lithum Game Sanctuary. The bird work was done primarily by my student Matthew Clark, but we were looking at birds, plants, and lichens in these stands. Each of the little points was one of our study stands, and you can see a little inset, green inset for Abraham Lake. So we had 3 points in there as well for our overmature stand. This is just an example of 4 species found in the Lithum Game Sanctuary and their abundance in the different stand types that were studied. So if you look at one of the graphs, so you have clear-cut regenerating is the first bar, immature young the second bar, mature and overmature the third bar, and then on the left side the orange is hardwood dominated stands, and the blue bars are conifer dominated stands. So you can see, in each of the 3 sets of bars, the forest is getting older as you go from left to right. So you can see that the magnolia warbler favors younger forest. And that was, I had said before, that was one of our most abundant birds. It was the most abundant bird in this study. It's also a declining species. Red-eyed vireo shows a preference for hardwood, as one would expect. Black-throated green warbler, a preference for older stands. So you can see it's increasing as you go to the right in each case. And it's found in mixed wood forests, so both the hardwood and softwood dominated. And the bay-breasted warbler is, compared to, say, the red-eyed vireo, is more of a coniferous species. We also compared the 5 points in the Abraham Lake Sanctuary to the other points in the Lithum, and found that certain species were more, like for example, black-throated green warblers, red-eyed vireos, bay-breasted warblers, Blackburnian warblers, and ovenbirds were more common in the sanctuary. And there were certain species that were only found in the reserve, including ruffed grouse, pileated woodpecker, downy woodpecker, yellow-bellied sapsucker, least flycatcher, brown creeper, Canada jay, Cape May warbler, evening grosbeak, and pine siskin. So some of these species are pretty common coniferous species, but they weren't found in the working landscape. We also did a study of riparian buffer width, so we're trying to figure out whether whether a 20-meter buffer is actually enough to support these birds. We had upland references, riparian references, and riparian buffers. Those were our 3 treatments. This is just a picture of an edge where we have a lot of blowdown. We did transects for the birds, and what we found was that riparian buffers are too narrow for many of the species. They did not maintain mature forest species, so they were dominated. The buffer transects were dominated by species found in regenerating forests like the magnolia warbler, white-throated sparrow, common yellowthroat, and dark-eyed junco. And so we recommended that buffer widths be increased, but nothing has happened. In terms of the evidence for a buffer width threshold, gray jays, black-throated green warblers, red-breasted nuthatches, and yellow-bellied flycatchers seem to need at least 25 to 35 meters wide buffer. Golden ground kinglet and brown creeper need at least 50 meters, and bay-breasted warbler and Blackburnian warbler need 75 to 100 meters. It would be great if buffers were 100 meters. That way we would provide habitat for pretty much all of the birds that would have been in that stand. I've done a fair bit of work on these 3 species of birds that primarily breed in forested wetlands. I won't say too much about them because I think a lot of you have heard me talk about them before, but I just would like to point out that that forested wetlands are a habitat at risk as well as containing many species at risk or rare species. Each of the species tends to use habitats with different amounts of shrub and ground vegetation. In terms of, if you look at the top row, in terms of the a number of snags and the proportion of coniferous and deciduous trees, they're quite similar for all 3 species. If you look at the composition of trees, it differs a bit for the species, but red maple, not surprisingly, is found in many of their sites, and spruce, and primarily that's black spruce. And also there are, if you look at the ecosites, there are certain ecosites that these forested wetlands that the birds use fall into, and so that could potentially be one way of helping to identify potential sites of these birds. Recently, I looked at what species might be impacted if we start having more plantations, as suggested in the high production forestry proposal. So this is a list of species of conservation concern that would be expected to be impacted by high production forestry because they either nest in cavities, which are always rare in plantations. And if you convert from a mature mixedwood or a mature softwood, then you're going to be impacting the birds in the next 2 columns. In the far right of 2 columns, if you have a plantation, when you go to harvest it or thin it, that could affect species of conservation concern as well. For example, common nighthawk do breed in young spruce plantations, as do yellow-bellied flycatcher, ruby crown kinglet, and magnolia warbler. And then in the older spruce plantations, bay-breasted warblers are known to do well in mature spruce plantations. And Cape May warblers and magnolia warblers also breed in these. So there's still a lot of issues around this high production forestry in terms of impacts on birds just within the stand itself. And Marc-André Viard has done a lot of work in New Brunswick showing that there's, that plantations have an effect at the landscape scale as well. You may want to have a look at this publication produced by the Canadian Forest Service called "Does Harvesting in Canada's Boreal Forests Affect Bird Populations?" They say that, basically looking at the evidence, only species that prefer young forests benefit from large amounts of overstory removal. But many species seem to be compatible with harvesting practices that mimic the natural disturbance regime of an area. So that seems to be the way things are going, trying to mimic natural disturbances for your region. But then there are species that need dead or dying trees for nesting or feeding. So one has to make sure that you keep those. And some species are sensitive to the loss of older forest. And so it's important to keep those species in mind as well. The last thing I want to talk about is these great resources that are available from Maine Audubon that were produced in conjunction with woodlot owners, foresters, birders, conservation practitioners. And it's basically how can we manage our woodland or our forests with birds in mind. So this one is the Woodland Owner's Guide to Forestry for Maine Birds. They go through a lot of basic concepts and terminology. it's not for foresters, it's just for the landowner. And they talk about the importance of structural diversity in the habitat and wildlife features. This is a cool little thing that sort of like you use your 10 fingers to look for different habitat features, from different canopies to snags to fallen debris, etc., that are important for wildlife. And they have these little species profiles. They've picked 20 priority forest bird species of the highest conservation concern for Maine. Some of these would also probably be the species we would pick, but others wouldn't be. So it wouldn't be a complete, you couldn't adopt it completely. They talk about their identification and natural history, their habitat associations, the type of forest, where they place their nests, where they feed, and what desirable conditions you can encourage if you want to encourage a species. And this is just the example for Black-Burnian warbler. If you look at the bottom, it shows the bird up high over on the right green bar, showing that it feeds high, and also the nest is high, so it feeds the nest high. So I think something like this could be really cool for Nova Scotia. And then they have a much more detailed technical manual for foresters. And so these are just some of the points they make. Sort of in summary, at the stand scale, one should encourage vertical and horizontal structural diversity that promotes medium to high density understory, midstory, and overstory cover. Promote structural diversity by fostering softwood inclusions and hardwood stands. One could do the reverse as well. Create small canopy gaps. Retain and recruit snags if needed, where operationally safe to do so. And always the larger the snag, the better. Retaining coarse and fine woody material and deciduous leaf litter. Messy woods are good woods for birds. Okay. Make sure that you don't have problems with invasive plants or pests or pathogens. Tread lightly in riparian areas and forested wetlands. And I'm hoping that we're going to be seeing some BMPs around forested wetlands. And avoid harvesting during the peak breeding season between May 15th and the end of July. And their landscape scale recommendations include, when possible, create and enhance large tracts, at least 250 acres. I'm not sure what that is in hectares, and keep a balance of different ages. Use multi-age silvicultural systems where possible, and where even age systems are more silviculturally appropriate, then incorporate stand level management strategies to provide for bird habitat. So in summary, I guess one thing I didn't mention is that the vertical structure of a stand is generally more important to the birds than the species composition. Although being coniferous versus deciduous is important for a lot of species. So the canopy position, whether there are gaps, large trunks, down logs, how much herbaceous cover, how much shrub cover, snags, these are all important for different species. And so to have a high diversity of species in a forest, you need to make sure that you have what each of those species needs. And in Nova Scotia, a lot of the past typical harvesting practices, heavy clear cutting and heavy overstory removal, have reduced the structural diversity of many of our forest stands. Okay, I think I will stop there. Let me see. Yes, I'll stop there. And if you have any questions, I guess Heba's going to read them out.
Yeah, so if anyone has any questions. So if anyone has any questions, you can type them out in the little chat box below, and then I can read them out. So we have a question. Given fidelity to territory, etc., it must be possible to predict effects of different harvesting regimes on bird populations. Yes.
I would say so. Well, the problem is that I don't think there's any evidence about what happens to those birds if they come back and their habitat isn't there. I think a lot of people assume they just go somewhere else. Well, they would have to go somewhere else. And if the harvesting happened while they were on territory, they would have I think they would have a very difficult time. And I've searched the literature for information on this. I can't find any evidence that those birds, if they lose their territory due to harvesting during the breeding season, whether they are actually going to be able to breed that year at all. So I think, getting back to Dave's question, I think one should be able to predict the effects of different harvesting regimes on bird populations, even if you don't worry so much about whether that same bird is coming back to a particular spot. Does that make sense? By simply knowing the preferences and the typical abundances of different species in different stand types under different management regimes, one should be able to predict put that in a model and run it and see how that's going to change bird populations in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that makes sense. So David has an additional comment, which is in regards to clear-cut refugees.
Right.
But just
Is that it?
Yeah.
That's right. That's it.
You want to define
Okay.
it?
Yes. So I think it's less of a problem if the clear cut happens when the bird isn't there.
Yeah.
But if a bird has set up a territory and the area is cut and it can't stay, maybe if it happened to be a small territory in a wildlife club, possibly, but I think unlikely. In the middle of the breeding season, it's really hard for birds to find another territory because the good territories are already taken. Its mate, if she survives and comes with him, that would be great, but maybe they'll break up. Study looking at what happens to the surrounding areas when an area is clear cut, and they found birds crowding into it, but I don't recall whether that was in the same season or subsequent seasons.
Great. Thank you. So another question is asking about the Maine Audubon.
Yep, Audubon.
There it is. Book. Is that available in Nova Scotia?
You can get it online. If you want to email me, I can send you the links, and you can just download all that stuff. It's all online.
Okay. Yeah, actually, if I'll ask you for the link later on, and then I can send it in the little thank you email. Actually.
Okay, sure.
That would work. Yeah. Perfect. And then last question, are forested wetlands harvested in Nova Scotia?
Yes. Um, I have walked through stands. I and people working with me have walked through stands that were cut. Not as much in apparently southwestern Nova Scotia as other parts of Nova Scotia, eastern Nova Scotia.
Okay, great, thank you. I think we have another, wait a couple more minutes for another question. Okay, we have another question. So, is there any evidence that soil calcium losses have affected bird populations in Nova Scotia?
There's no evidence for Nova Scotia. One would expect that it would have, though. A species that's been studied in the eastern U.S. is the wood thrush, and it has been affected. I've been interested in getting involved in some liming studies, but it just never happened.
Absolutely. So another question about wetlands, is it against the law to harvest in wetlands?
Not a forested wetland.
Wow.
An open wetland you cannot harvest in. Well, there aren't any trees, but a forested wetland, yes, you can harvest in. There are no laws. There are even, I believe, as the wetlands regulations are currently written, that they don't even consider migratory birds that are species at risk as being important enough to do anything.
Wow.
The only residents at risk.
Oh, wow, I didn't know that.
So that's something that I think needs to be changed in the regulations.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. So in regards to kind of education, we have a question. How can we educate homeowners to cut smaller pieces of lawn?
Smaller pieces of what?
Smaller pieces of lawn. I think it's in
Oh,
regards
do you mean
to
to have less lawn around your
yeah,
house?
like I'm assuming like a woodlot owner might
Oh, yes.
have like a smaller lawn and keep more of their land as like a woodland.
Well, I'm not familiar with anything off the top of my head in terms of resources, but um, I know there's a lot of stuff out there about, um, creating habitat for birds around your houses, um, producing more, planting more shrubs with berries, for example. I don't know. There's something about lawns that people like. So yes, they do have to be educated about that.
Yeah,
I don't know that I'm the person to do that. But maybe, yeah, I don't know. It's a good point though.
yeah. Is there kind of any evidence that having more like cutting less of your lawn or even kind of converting your lawn into more of like planting more wildflowers and shrubs, like you said, is better for bird habitat?
Oh, definitely. Yeah, there is. Yeah,
Yeah. So I guess like for people who do have
yeah. One
existing
problem,
lawns. Oh yeah.
one problem if your house is surrounded by shrubs and trees, you may have more birds flying into your windows.
Oh, know that.
Or if you have your feeder very close to the house, they may fly into the windows.
So having your feeder a little bit away is a good, it's
Yeah.
good thing to note. Okay, I think that's it for questions. Thank you so much for the presentation. It was really interesting.
Well, thank you very much for having me. And if anyone would like any additional information, you can just email me. I'll send the link for the Maine Audubon resources, and my email address will be on there as well.
Sounds good. Thank you so much again. Thank you for everyone who joined in today. It's really great to see everyone joining in and the questions. Next week's webinar is on medicinal plant foraging, so that'll be really interesting to kind of get out and explore and do some foraging yourself. Other than that, we do have more webinars planned, which hopefully we'll be posting sometime this week. So that's the plan, to have more webinars posted. And that's about it for today. Thanks again, and have a great rest of your day.
Bye-bye.
See ya.